Hello everyone, welcome back in my channel. So today I am going to explain another topic of methods of educational psychology. So today I have decided that today I will explain experimental method or scientific method. So let's start. So at first, experimental or scientific method is totally mm, based on science. So this in this most in this method is totally most scientific and objective method for the studying behavior. So it is called the control conditions, and in this method basically occurred in the lab basis. So let's know what is the experimental method. Experimental is based totally, we know that the based on totally scientific, and his method also studying the behavior in scientific way. So it is always the measure the scientific measurement of behavior. Now we know about the variability of experimental method. So experimental method has three variability. Number one, independent variable. Number two, dependent variable, and number three, intervening variables. So let's explain. Number one, independent variable. Independent variable is totally free, or it's occur totally freedom. When a individual is totally free about his work, that times this variable is called independent variables. When number two, dependent variable. When a researcher or a scholar depends on someone or anyone for collecting data, that times it is called dependent variable. And lastly is three, intervening variable. So intervening variable is the variance of those two types of independent and dependent variable. So sometimes it is called intervening or is disturbing variable. So when a researcher conduct a research on any kinds of topic, that times independent and dependent is basically occurred, but it is sometimes mandatory that intervening variables comes in his research work, and it is also various work in the social science or experimental method of the lab based science. So in these sessions we know about the what is the experimental method and variability of experimental method. There are the three variability: independent variability, dependent variability, and intervening variability. So now I am disclose the another parts of this experimental method is characteristics. So at first, the experimental method is basically a subject, basically have some subject. So experimenter or experimentations is depend on the subject on which subject is based on the research. So the experimental or scientific method is at first select the subject, and next number two, person is random order. So the person or the researcher or research scholars must be a random order. He collect the data from the society, from the other sections or anywhere. He must be randomly taken the data from the society. So lastly, thirdly is the controlling the variables. So we know previously that variables is three types: independent variables, dependent variables, and intervening variables. So in this three types of variables is controlled by the researcher. So as a researcher, as a scholar, when you are conducting the research on any kinds of topic, that times this variable will come in your research. But how to handle this or how do you control this, it is the capacity of the researcher. So next is the measurement of the effects. What is the measurement? What you select the data, what are you doing in the research work, how do you do in the research work, all these measurements also conduct in your research work. So it is the main 4 characteristics of this research of this experimental methods. Now we know the techniques of experimental method. So there are the 3 techniques of experimental method. So number 1 is control test method, number 2 is control group method, and number 3 is rotation method. So number 1, at first we know about the number 1 techniques of experimental method. So number 1 is control test method. So what is the control test? Control tests occur in a normal condition. So as a researcher, when conducted a research in any kinds of field, that times he control the any variable. This is occurred in the normal condition. So his in the experimental method primary techniques is control test method. Number 2 is control group method. Group means 2 or the more separate group, 2 or the more person is involved in this techniques. So the control groups, which groups is controlled by me, this method also included here. There are 2 or the more persons will be included in this research work. So last is that 3 is rotation method. Rotation means 2 or more stimulating situation also occurring here. So in this situation, the rotation is 2 or more stimulating situations occur one by one. So now we learn about the techniques of experimental research. So there are the 3 types of techniques. There are the control test method, there is a control group method, and another is the rotation method. Now we know about the merits of the experimental method. Let's explain. First merits of the experimental method is the most systematic. We know the experimental method is basically a scientific method. So scientific method is always based on a system. So its first merit is most systematic process of this experimental method. So most systematics occur in his research work. So it is the important merits for research. Number 2 is the provides precious information. It provides precious information. So we know that the research always invention or discover the many things in society or lab basis experiment. So in this situations, when a researcher acquire some knowledge about the about his research work, that times this information is so much precious for his or her. So this is the main another merits of experimental method. Now we disclose the number 3 merits of experimental method. Next, it is also a innovative idea. Innovative, we know that when a researchers do the research in his research field, that times he is also created some innovative ideas and create some new things of his research work. So this is the meaning and this is the merits of this of his or her in research work. Next, we are going to explain the another merits of experimental method is can recorded variables. So it can record variables or recorded variable. When the researcher conduct the research, that times he depends on the three types of variable, that is independent variable, dependent variable and intervening variables. Each variable can record the all data by the given by the research work. So this is the four types of merits of the experimental method. The last merits of experimental method is laboratory experiment. We know that sometimes experimental method is occur in the lab basis. So in this laboratory situations, the researcher faced many problems of his experimental field. So it sometimes is laboratory basis. So this merits is laboratory experiment. So laboratory is conducted by the researcher, and what to do and how to the result by the product, it depends on the research. So this is the 5 most important merits of experimental method. Next, I am going to explain the demerits of experimental method. Number 1, it is so much time consuming. It is so much time consuming. So at first it is so much time consuming. So in this research is so much long time. It is workshop is so much long time. So we can say that it is the demerits of this research. The time consuming is just so much demerits of experimental research. Next, artificially determined. Sometimes the researchers collect or the data from the society, from the other field. That times he sometimes collects the data. It is called artificially determined. So this is the demerits of the experimental method. Last, the demerits is not possible to control tools. Sometimes there are some tools has come in his research. That times the researcher cannot control his. Sometimes the researcher has not control these tools. So it is occur, and it's also disturbance of his research work. So this is the a framework of this experimental research. So today we have learned about the what is the experimental method, what is the variability of experimental method, what is the characteristics of the experimental method, what is the techniques of the experimental method, and know about the merits and demerits. So today we know about these 6 steps or 6 criteria of experimental method. So lastly, we know about the steps of the scientific method. So it is the so basically important for every research field. So at first, when the steps of scientific method. So the steps of the scientific method firstly is observation. When a researcher conducts some research in the research field, that time he must be a good observer. So this is the observation skill is very important for his the research work or for his scientific method. So next is the form question. So researcher when conducted some question paper for his research paper, so that times the research question will be very carefully and making the questions with the very carefully, and this question will be valid or invalid checked by the expert. So after that the researcher form a hypothesis and testing it is accepted or rejected or is a null or etc. So this is the main steps of the scientific method. Number 4 is experiment. When the researcher making hypothesis and his before conclusion he thinking about this method is called experiment. So it is his right view or not, that times he is talking in yourself, that is the experiment. Or in this sometimes section when a researcher conduct his research in a lab base, that times the experimental will be some result, it is accepted or not. And lastly is the analysis. So analysis is the prime or last part of every research formation. So analysis part is that when a researcher solve this all types of observation, of questionnaire, of hypothesis and experiment, at lastly he is conclude and analysis the part of scientific method. So in this chapter or in these topics we have learned that what is the experimental method, what is the variability of the experimental method, what is the characteristics of the experimental method, what is the techniques of the experimental method, and know about the merits and demerits, and also know about the steps of the scientific method. So class, today I now quit this section here. Next day I will explain the another topic of methods of educational psychology. So bye.